So a very good morning to all of you joining us from Bangkok. A good day to everyone else joining us online. As most of you know, this is the Thematic Solution Forum, and we are organizing this session in a hybrid format. So we have participants joining us on in person here in Bangkok at the United Nations Conference Center. We also have an increasing number of participants joining us online. So welcome again, everyone. My name is Cecilia Oh. I'm the program advisor of the HIV Health and Development Group of UNDP, based in the Bangkok Regional Hub. So first of all, let me just say warm welcome. And we are here to join the Thematic Solution Forum on Social Protection and Health, looking at South-South and triangular cooperation to enhance capacity to produce and deliver vaccines. I think this is a very timely issue and a subject matter to be discussing today against the backdrop of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we have seen that there have been stark inequalities between and within countries in terms of access to vaccines and other health technologies that are needed to address the COVID-19 pandemic, but also in terms of the health systems that we have within our countries. So I think this is, a very good forum to have this discussion in terms of how can we be looking at being better prepared, but also looking at the role of South-South and triangular cooperation. I'm sure that most of you would have seen the flyers, so I'll quickly go into the objectives of this particular thematic forum. I think, as we said before, we would like to have a discussion that underscores the importance and the potential for South-South and triangular cooperation to help countries of the Global South scale up responses to the crisis, not just this one, but also emerging ones that we can foresee in the future. And how do we develop the solutions that are tailored to our needs and context? I think the second objective is to highlight the range of cross-border issues that affect affordable and equitable access to essential vaccines, as well as other health technologies, and present the possibilities for regional cooperation to enhance such access. And thirdly, we hope that this discussion is the start of us establishing a platform for countries in Asia and the Pacific and beyond to deepen our engagement in South-South and triangular cooperation to strengthen health system resilience and boost readiness to produce and deliver vaccines and other health technologies. So I'm very happy to say that the co-organizers, of this forum are seated here. We have the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. We are also represented by the United Nations Development Program and the World Health Organization. So as the three co-organizers of this Thematic Solution Forum, we're very pleased to welcome you. I have the unenviable task of introducing the speakers, but let me do that in terms of their speaking to the audience. So first, I have Professor Rupa Chanda. She will be the moderator. Let me very quickly go through the introduction. I'm sure we'll get to know each other much better as we proceed in this discussion. But Professor Chanda is the Director of Trade, Investment and Innovation, TIID at UNOSSC. Before joining ESCAP, Professor Chanda was a Professor of Economics at IIM Bangalore and the Dean of Programs at the Institute. She received a PhD in Economics from Columbia University and a bachelor's from Harvard University. And I think doubtless or needless for me to say that her research interests are very wide, but they include the WTO issues, trade and services, regional integration, and migration. I'm also then quickly going to introduce our eminent panel of speakers and panelists. So first up, we have Professor Dr. Anthony So. He's the professor of the practice and founding director of the Innovation and Design Enabling Access or IDEA initiative at the Johns Hopkins University. He's also the director of the Strategic Policy Program of REACT, which is the Action and Antibiotic Resistance, working with a global network dedicated to meeting the challenge of antimicrobial resistance. Professor Anthony So also served as one of the co-conveners of the UN Interagency Coordination Group on Antimicrobial Resistance that delivered recommendations to the United Nations Secretary General in 2019. And more recently, he was the co-chair of the Technical Working Group aligning pharmaceutical innovation incentives to achieve fair pricing for the WHO Fair Pricing Forum in 2021. And obviously, he has also contributed to a broad range of advisory groups, including those on accelerating rare diseases research, orphan product development, as well as being on the expert advisory group of the UN Secretary General's high-level panel on access to medicines. The second speaker we have today is Professor Frederick Abbott. Professor Abbott is the Edward Ball Eminent Scholar, Professor of International Law at the Florida State University College of Law. Professor Abbott has served as expert consultant for numerous international and regional organizations, as well as governments and non-governmental organizations in the field of intellectual property, public health, trade, competition, and sustainable development. He's currently a member of the Technical Advisory Group, or the TAG, of the WHO CTAD program, and has served as consultant to WHO, UNDP, and other multilateral organizations. Let me just also say that Professor Abbott has joined us, stepped in at the last minute. You'll see on the agenda that Professor Padma Srigal Sampath was to speak. She is unwell, so Professor Abbott has kindly stepped in, and he's well able to speak in this forum, as he is a co-author of the paper that they're going to be presenting. Then finally, we have two panelists who will be joining the discussion. The first off, we have Professor Dr. Narendra Kumar Arora, who is the Executive Director of INCLEN, the International Clinical Epidemiology Network in New Delhi. He is a former faculty member of the Pediatric Gastroenterology, Hematology and Nutrition at the All India Institute of Medical Sciences in New Delhi. Professor Arora served as a chair and member of the WHO Strategic Advisory Group of Experts on Immunization, SAGE, from 2010 to 2016, as well as the Southeast Asia Regional Immunization Technical Advisory Group. Clearly, Professor Arora has made major contributions at both the national and global levels to the immunization sector, and we'll be pleased to hear from him. And then finally, we have Dr. Nakorn Prem Sri, who is the director of the National Vaccine Institute in Thailand, and he has extensive experience in health promotion, disease prevention and control, as well as in public health program management. Dr. Nakorn is a doctor by training, receiving his medical training from the Faculty of Medicine at Chulalongkorn University. As the director of the National Vaccine Institute, Dr. Nakorn proposed the regional initiative, the ASEAN Vaccine Security and Self-Reliance, AVSSR initiative, which has been adopted by the leaders of ASEAN. So I think this is very much a topic that we will be discussing. I think with that introduction, I am very pleased to hand over the floor to Professor Chanda.
Thank you very much, Cecilia. So a very warm welcome and a good morning to everybody here as well as online. Without further ado, since we have very little time and a lot to discuss and two solid presentations, let's move to the first presentation. This is by Professor So. So Professor So, could you kindly share your screen and start the presentation of your paper?
Well, thank you to the organizers for the opportunity to participate on this important thematic solution forum. We are delighted to share some perspectives on how a regional approach to ensuring vaccine access might be supported through South-South and triangular cooperation. And this builds on work that ESCAP and WHO have commissioned in its From Lab to Jab project on improving Asia-Pacific's readiness to produce and deliver vaccines, led by Rupa Chandan and Matthias Hebel. Now, as we face the stark inequity of how COVID-19 vaccine access has been allocated, we are reminded that this is not a new story in global health, nor a challenge that could be solved at the country level. Infectious diseases readily cross borders, but the means by which we respond to pandemic challenges do not. And it is this asymmetry in how we globalize resources that creates this challenge to health equity. During non-pandemic times, market approval of products to address communicable diseases in sub-Saharan Africa has typically lagged by 4 to 7 years after initial approval in high-income countries. During pandemic times, the delay may be shorter, but the unmet demand more acute, and saving lives in one's own country can seem to trade-offs against helping others beyond one's borders. But uncertainty and the sense of shared security at the national level can make it challenging, even for countries of goodwill, to make sacrifices that seem to compromise health security at home. As the graph on the right reveals, higher income countries in the purple and blue strongly outpaced their lower income counterparts in red in vaccinating their populations. However, if we are to find a more equitable path out of this pandemic than the road into it, we must ask, how might we not keep repeating this story over and over again? A key reason why this story repeats itself is that equity is path dependent. To develop and produce vaccines, much of the financing for vaccines came from high-income countries, and clinical trials and manufacturing were mounted where there was existing infrastructure. To procure vaccines, those with the capital were at the front of the line, and those without at the back. And to deliver vaccines, having trained healthcare personnel to roll out the vaccines and an effective cold chain to transport and store these products, again gave advantage to higher income countries with the capacity. No surprise, the race to vaccinate one's population strongly favored those who had run the course fast before. Might a regional approach to vaccine access broaden the umbrella of coverage and health security? So why a regional approach to vaccine access, we might reasonably ask? Regional collective action can bank on a history of shared economies and trade patterns that give contour to regional alliances, from the inclusive regionalism of ASEAN to mega regional trade deals, such as the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. Some of these alliances, as in the Asia-Pacific region, may also be sub-regional. This is not to say that efforts are not needed, nor that it's not to say that global efforts are not needed, nor that regional efforts would not bolster global. After all, the pandemic influenza preparedness framework grew out of regional concerns over avian flu, advanced by Indonesia, over the need for more equitable benefit sharing from the global system to share influenza virus samples. Of note, the pandemic influenza preparedness framework commits research institutions and manufacturers receiving biological materials from the global influenza surveillance and response system to sharing future products for pandemic response in a predictable way. If a company uses the biological materials for a commercial product, after the first 400 million doses of vaccines based on a current technology, the company commits to set aside for WHO 10% of its vaccine production, and 8 out of 10 of those doses are made available on a donation basis. Bringing vaccines to market for pandemic preparedness and response involves multiple steps, many bolstered by regional efforts. On the supply side, knowledge networks like the Indian Council of Medical Research's regional research platform on infectious diseases of public health importance in the WHO Southeast Asia region supported R&D even before the pandemic. Several platforms have emerged to support regulatory cooperation, and a WHO regional COVID-19 vaccine hub is also taking shape. On the demand side, taxes and duties have been lowered on vaccine products and inputs, and a single window electronic submission system speeds clearance of vaccine shipments across borders. And in Latin America, WHO's Pan-American Health Organization carries out strategic pool procurement for vaccines and for other health commodities. By arraying these initiatives across the vaccine value chain, we can see the potential of coordinating such regional collective action in an end-to-end approach to bringing such life-saving commodities as vaccines to those in need. But what might motivate countries to embark on such regional collective action? An initial quick take might come from the quadrant diagram analysis we have on the left of this slide of UNESCAP member countries and territories in the Asia-Pacific region. Now, we could have chosen any number of dimensions to gauge risk and resilience against pandemic risks, but this short exercise reveals that some countries are more likely to be at risk. Those that were unable to achieve 70% vaccination coverage, or which were totally reliant on external sources for COVID-19 vaccine production, the lower left-hand quadrant. By contrast, the upper right-hand quadrant in green are those countries that both achieve the target population vaccination coverage and also have domestic vaccine production capacity. In red text, we also highlight those countries classified by the World Bank as least developed. Not surprisingly, most are found in the lower left-hand quadrant and none in the upper right-hand green quadrant. These findings are also consistent with what we might expect given UNDP's observation, seen on the right-hand side of this slide, that it is just a much heavier lift for low-income countries compared to high-income countries to cover the cost of vaccinating 70% of their populations. For low-income countries, to do so could require increasing their healthcare spending by over 50%, while for high-income countries, healthcare spending would only need to be boosted by less than 1%. Now, regional collective action will require a coalition of the willing, and this might take any of a number of forms. It also may be sub-regional or beyond regions, but as illustrated, history, economic ties, and cross-border traffic and trade can serve as a useful foundation for sharing risks and building resilience together against future pandemics. Countries at greatest risk of limited vaccine access, like those that we saw in the left lower quadrant, might have more reason to join such a regional effort. In such cases, the reliance on importing vaccines means that certain parts of the vaccine value chain might receive priority attention, such as regional pool procurement, regulatory cooperation, and cross-border trade. Now, for a country, though, with significant domestic vaccine manufacturing capacity, but with interest and commitment to scale to supply other countries, they might be more keen about a different part of the vaccine value chain, investments in local production. And when multiple countries step up to support the initial critical mass of a coalition of the willing, then the opportunity may arise to see which alternative sourcing leads to health sector delivery with the most equitable allocation of vaccines in the countries of the coalition of the willing. Importantly, we should keep in mind that the X factor, political, economic, and security considerations well beyond just vaccines or health, looms large in shaping regional collective action. Of course, the way we bring vaccines to market, they do not naturally behave in the economic sense like public goods. However, with public sector intervention, we can help create conditions whereby they might be accessed more like public goods. By making the building blocks of knowledge more widely shared, the R&D of the value chain, we might make R&D inputs less excludable. And this in turn might enable broader scale up of local production and increased capacity and availability of vaccines would also make vaccines less rivalrous. Regional collective action also offers the opportunity to pilot other approaches. What if, for the next pandemic, we did not have to worry about negotiating licenses held by private companies? After all, pandemics often outpace patent offices processing patent applications. Imagine if we had, instead of a property rights regime, we had a liability regime. A property right excludes others from using an invention. By contrast, a liability rule allows one to freely take the materials for any research purpose without the need for any permission to use. But if the research leads to a commercial application, then there is a requirement to pay up equitable compensation at that point in time. Certain building blocks of knowledge could be pooled under a compensatory liability or cost-sharing regime, that is a use first, pay later approach. We might draw some lessons from how the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture works. Building on the principles of benefit sharing and access in the Convention on Biological Diversity, this treaty creates a global pool of plant genetic materials and provides access to this repository to farmers, plant breeders, and scientists. The pool includes access to genetic materials of 64 crops, comprising 80% of the food we derive from plants. Accessing the genetic materials in the pool comes with material transfer agreement conditions. Either one must share any new developments with others for further research, or if one wants to keep such developments to oneself, one has to pay a percentage of commercial benefits to a common fund that supports technology transfer. Coming into force in 2004, the treaty has established a multilateral system that now has 148 ratifying parties, including the European Union. And since the system started up in 2007, there have been millions of accessions of plant genetic material with several hundred transactions each day. Such a compensatory liability regime applied by a coalition of the willing might go a long way towards reducing excludability of vaccines. Now, to make vaccines less rivalrous, however, we need to ensure not only more rapid scale-up of vaccine production, but fair access to what is coming off the production line. One way of doing so is to locate such production closer to those who are served. I believe Fred will delve deeper into how this might play out, so I will just make a few brief observations. Approaches like the WHO-supported regional mRNA technology transfer hubs and the BioNTech modular containers that allow manufacturing facilities to be shipped to new locales could help decentralize manufacturing. And this may allow an upgrading of vaccine facilities, now only fulfilling fill and finish roles, to becoming producers of drug substance for vaccine production. Making such infrastructure sustainable in non-pandemic times is also key. And this is why the mRNA vaccine platform is so attractive as a starting point. It might be repurposed for endemic disease targets, ranging from influenza and HIV to respiratory syncytial virus, and maybe even malaria. And these disease targets might sustain the infrastructure for vaccine production in non-pandemic times. Now, at the intersection of the supply and demand side of the market is procurement, and pooled procurement has worked effectively at the national, global, and regional levels. UNICEF helped to pave the way for strategic pooled procurement, carrying out global aggregate forecasts, shifting to longer-term contracting for specific vaccines, and awarding multiple manufacturers to build a more robust supply system. And we can learn from and perhaps even build also upon the experiences of the Global Drug Facility. It has become a one-stop shop for TB commodities. Using a strategic rotating stockpile, it smooths out the disruptions of spot shortages of some TB products by ensuring that those who need the drug now get it first and others later. And in providing technical assistance to country programs, it can help support scale-up of the use of antimicrobials in resource-limited settings. In 2007, the WHO held a meeting to consider how to build on the idea of regional pooled procurement. But for over 40 years, the PAHO, or Pan American Health Organization's revolving fund for access to vaccines, has worked to secure the best prices for 41 countries and territories, provided access to a credit line for 60 days for repayment with no interest, and procured over $1 billion in vaccine products in 2021 for its member states. And we will need such institutional infrastructure to ensure an end-to-end approach. In closing, a regional approach must find value-added leverage, building upon both ongoing efforts at the country level and drawing upon the existing global architecture for pandemic response. To fix the challenges that we described as path-dependent equity, where one invests in the vaccine value chain as part of a regional approach must be strategic. Building the coalition of the willing requires weighing far more than risk and resilience of countries over the vaccine supply and delivery. If your economy depends on key parts being delivered from another country in the region, and this would be disrupted by the lack of vaccine uptake in that neighboring country, this non-health factor will spill over into how one country would be motivated to help another regional trading partner. And it requires finding the X factor. And to make vaccines available more like public goods, our regional strategy may allow piloting new approaches, like a compensatory liability regime to make such goods less excludable, and local production regional pool procurement to make them less rivalrous. We hope this framework provides a useful stepping stone to considering how a regional approach can help better ensure vaccine access. Thank you for the opportunity of sharing these thoughts.
Thank you, Professor So, for laying out the many possibilities for regional collective action, as well as alerting us to some of the limitations or the challenges that might arise in the process. So let me turn to our Next presenter, Professor Frederick Abbott, who will be presenting highlights from the paper, Regionalizing Pharmaceutical Production and Innovation, which was prepared for the UNDP. Professor Abbott?
Yes, thank you, Professor Chandra. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
All right. So good morning. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. And I'm going to be presenting the results of a paper that was prepared by Professor Padmashri Gill Sampath and myself. And as was noted earlier, she's not well today, and I offered to step in and present our paper on our mutual behalf. So Professor Gill Sampath is more along the economist industrial policy specialist side with her expertise, and I am more along the legal expertise line. And so we combine our skills. We work together on any number of projects, of course, including this one. And this is its own form of South-North collaboration. Professor Gill Sampath is from India. And with respect to our paper, and this was stimulated by some questions from Cecilia O at UNDP along the lines of what's next, by which I mean, if, for example, you attended WHO's Local Production Day this past year with Jishi Duang hosting and so forth, you would have found that almost every presenter at that point, whether it was from the European Union, from the Gates Foundation, from the various regional organizations, pretty much every speaker spoke of regionalization of local production as what I would say has essentially become an accepted value at this point. So our paper does not try to explain, again, why, in general, the idea of regional production may be useful. I would only add, and I mentioned this in an email to the organizers the other morning, if COVID-19 hasn't convinced you of the importance of creating a legal regional support network and local supply chains for vaccine production, that it's unlikely that anything will. So we accept that as a premise. And you not only have, as Anthony So was mentioning, the inequitable outcome of vaccine distribution in COVID-19, but we've also seen a general deterioration in trade relations and a fragmentation of the international trading system. So things in general are not moving in a kind of positive global network in terms of supply chains, and provides another argument in favor of moving towards localization of production. Now, this, of course, isn't a new idea. The idea of trying to create a regional industrial policy and allocating production goes back, at least as far as the Andean Pact in the early 1970s and their efforts at coordinating regional industrial policy. But one thing that we found lacking, and our response stimulated by Cecilia's question, is one might say, so we've now agreed that regionalization of local production is a good idea, but what precisely do we think that looks like? And in point of fact, a very limited amount of research and study has gone into the actual preferential structures for the regional system of local production. So what our paper does is sets out various options for what the regional production framework might look like, and discusses potential advantages and disadvantages of those. We start by noting that one of the approaches may well be a region that simply provides an incentive structure for private industry, essentially to organize itself within the region. Now, while that sounds like a very unambitious approach, given the current structure of the pharmaceutical R&D and production system worldwide, that may be, in fact, the most likely adopted approach to regionalization. When we look also at the limits of what governments might do in a coordinated way about industrial policy. So the idea then is that national and regional authorities try to create a framework which will attract investment and allow businesses to evolve in a way in which they themselves are allocating the production capacity within the region. And, very simply, for example, if one company decides they're going to invest $200 million to build a production plant for a particular pharmaceutical in the region, it's unlikely that another company will decide to do precisely that same thing and will instead allocate its investment resources into some other productive activity. So the private sector has its own way of creating efficient allocation of resources. The one additional contribution, among others, we discuss in the paper that's important is the risk is that national governments, in seeking to provide incentives, will then engage in a beauty contest with respect to attracting investment, employment, and so forth, and so provide incentives that essentially involve a race to the bottom in the sense that each government is enhancing the amount of incentives or drawing back from the benefits that might be gained from particular investments. So the idea is to try to create a maximum set of incentives that will be used to avoid that type of beauty contest. And a recent illustration includes the OECD's agreement on a 15% minimum tax on corporate profits as a way to prevent competition on tax incentives within the OECD. When most of us have talked about regional production, I think that implicitly we've been talking about some form of geographic concentration. That is the idea of placing a number of production facilities or many production facilities at a single geographic location. And the advantages of that are to create an integrated network of infrastructure and suppliers, to provide the kind of web of support resources that you see in countries like India and China, where you have a support network evolve around the production facilities. You can reduce transport inefficiencies and so forth by combining all of these activities in a geographic location. And that, of course, wouldn't necessarily mean one regional hub within a region, but you could have several regional hubs within a region, and perhaps each concentrating on a specialization of one type of product, be it small molecule chemical products on one side or biopharma products on another side, and vaccine products or diagnostics on another side. And so different regional parts of the regional system specializing in different areas. You can take a look at the example, for example, of India, which has established various pharma cities, and they've tried to establish, for example, API production facilities proximate to hydrocarbon resource production facilities so that you can take advantage of shared inputs. You can also take advantage of shared waste disposal and other requirements of pharmaceutical production, locating near energy resources. So there are a lot of potential advantages of geographic concentration, but that does leave numerous questions, which, as one might say, have bedeviled regional integration from time zero, which is, well, where located? Which country is going to be the regional hub? What law is going to govern? Who's going to be responsible for the government? How are taxes going to be allocated? And without going into detail about that, the questions of budget and taxation are huge issues in regionalization, because as you allocate production to a particular location, you may be allocating tax benefits in a particular location or tax revenues, and how are you going to allocate tax revenues? How are you going to share budgetary requirements and so forth? So these are all questions that need to be addressed, and they have not to date been addressed in depth in most geographies that I'm familiar with. Another model is distribution along stages of production. So, for example, allocating particular tasks within particular countries in the region at different levels according to their capacity. Certain countries responsible for API production, or the basic resources of biologics production, others for fill and finish, others for packaging and labeling, others as distribution hubs. One can envision distributing along stage of production lines, or you could simply allocate to different countries the responsibility from start to finish of developing and producing particular products, and then organizing that along regional lines. Now, the problems with this idea of distribution along particularly stages or even per product is that the whole system can be undermined by a weak link. If someone fails to fulfill their obligation, how's that going to be fixed? There's various ways you can address that through redundancy or backup through imports or so forth, but these are questions that are raised. Another potential is just elaborate or in greater South-South collaboration across what I'll refer to as the Global South in terms of investment in R&D and production. So you can have South-South integrated supply chain based on low and middle income country cooperation. Of course, that's going on today. That can incorporate technical cooperation and training. For example, integrating the Indian night powers institutes and so forth. And the problem, again, is each of these has some inherent problems. If you've got geographical separation, you again have risks of supply chain disruptions, and you also have inherent risks of politicization and issues arising out of that. Another approach is the promotion of regional champions, right? To designate one particular or several particular countries who have particular advanced capacities in particular areas to serve as the vectors of particular regions, and hopefully then bringing along resources from other parts of the region to provide inputs or collaborate in the further elaboration of the regional production system. Again, doesn't necessarily alleviate concerns about supply chain security. And I'll mention that, of course, one aspect of regionalization of production is the great importance of the regional approach to drug regulation. You have various efforts underway in various regions, but if one is looking to evolution paths, a natural place to look is the European Union, which today has the EMA, but that, again, bear in mind, was a long process of evolution. It started with a decision going from national autonomous drug regulatory authorities. The first thing the EC, then the EU did was to create measures of approximation. So all the national authorities were supposed to begin to engage in drug approval processes along the same pathway. Then you develop mutual recognition systems that ultimately led to what you have today, which is most approvals are carried out at the EMA level. But bear in mind that that was, a 30-year process to get from the starting point to where you are today with the fully integrated system. But this is particularly important for accelerating the introduction of vaccines. You also have major questions in terms of governance, and these are key questions, right? So if you look at the history of regional integration across the board, going back, well, to Simon Bolivar, but, back to the regional integrations of the 1970s and so forth. You've had very few, very successful efforts at regional integration, and that is primarily because governments are by definition ceding elements of their national autonomy. And so most of the current regional organization efforts do not invest regional authorities with substantial powers to make industrial policy decisions on behalf of the members. You can do that by saying we only make decisions if they're achieved by consensus. And so that reduces the possibilities for intrusion on autonomy. But as we see from the WTO and elsewhere, it's very difficult to govern by consensus. So how do you create a decision-making structure which all governments are amenable to? And that's a very difficult process. It's been challenging throughout the history of regional organization. But given the current state of regional organization efforts, if you're going to adopt any of the models that Padmasree and I discussed, you're going to have most likely a self-standing international agreement in which this decision-making authority is specifically prescribed and allocated to the regional organization. Otherwise, the regional organization doesn't have the authority to make these type of decisions about where to allocate production, how to allocate tax revenues, how to govern within the regional structure, and so forth. So none of that just flows as a matter of course. The key takeaway, this isn't necessarily an optimistic thought, but it's trying to be realistic, that the general idea, let's regionalize local production, leaves many unanswered questions. And I'm well aware that these things have been addressed going back through the manufacturing plan for Africa and so forth, which included some elements of these things. But if you look, for example, at the current African Union effort, along with the African Free Trade Area Agreement, you'll see that there is not much done in terms of actual delegation of authority to undertake industrial policy decisions by regional decision-making. Most of the decision-making is still made at the national level on the basis, for example, of recommendations of the authorities. And finally, to note that in each of these processes, there are many stakeholders who are going to be affected. Existing industries who are located in particular geographies, who might not be wild about the idea of regionalizing local production in particular locations. You have investors, you have financial institutions, you have patient groups, and so forth. So the process becomes quite burdened with the interests of stakeholders and how you move that forward. And again, I'm not trying to be pessimistic. I'm merely saying that there's a lot of things that need to be considered in trying to map this out as a really practical solution to problems beyond concluding that regionalization is a good idea, which is something which I think most of us have come around to accepting as a premise. So thank you. I hope that wasn't too long.
Thank you very much, Professor Abbott. Again, you've highlighted the possibilities for regional models, the hub and spoke sort of approach, or having distributed supply chains. But again, the critical issues of governance, which would be a major challenge in effecting such models. So thanks a lot. Now let us turn to our panelists, Dr. Arora and Dr. Premsri. So Dr. Premsri, you've had very rich professional experience in Thailand. Of course, you're the director of the National Vaccine Institute, and you're also coordinating on behalf of ASEAN. So my first question really is on this regional approach. So ASEAN has signaled its interest in a regional framework for cooperation and coordination aimed at vaccine security and self-reliance. For example, the Regional Strategic and Action Plan for ASEAN Vaccine Security and Self-Reliance 2021-25 seeks to establish greater regional R&D capacity as well as financing for regional production. So given your experience with ASEAN, what are the major challenges to reaching the goals of regional production in ASEAN? And in your view, how should ASEAN move forward in terms of regional cooperation for vaccine production? I'd also like to follow that up with another question, because NVI is playing the major facilitating role in this regard. So what, in your view, would be the strategic direction to mobilize development among ASEAN member states to achieve the vaccine security and self-reliance goal? Over to you, Dr. Premsri.
Thank you. Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Chanda, and I do thanks both of the presenter, Dr. Anthony So and Dr. Frederick Abbott, for an excellent presentation and very informative and comprehensive information, and that facilitating us a lot on in kind of regional approach. And thank you very much. So regarding to the question, I think we need to have a kind of collective approach with our ASEAN member states. One of the major challenge of local production is about the capacity of the human resource. Vaccine development and vaccine production is not an easy task, and it's not a kind of favorable business. We experienced a lot on trial and failure and success, but failure more than success on vaccine development. Lesson learned from maybe HIV vaccine development or dengue vaccine development. So it do need a lot on investment, and the key element is human resource, the capacity of the scientists and vaccine developer within the region or within the country. So that's one of the challenges. So as NVI is a focal point on AVSSR, we focus more on human resource development, on the kind of training and building up the capacity of the people on the vaccine development. I do believe that during COVID-19 pandemic, some of the countries in ASEAN, such as Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and the Philippines, have developed a lot on the capacity, and they also have a policy on building up the capacity on local production of vaccine. So this is one of the good sign and good strategy that we can collect the effort together on this kind of thing. And in the same way as Dr. Frederick addressed that COVID-19 triggered us a lot on considering of local production. However, the regional approach is a kind of collaboration that to share the resource, building up the capacity, and pull up the resource to the region, because even within ASEAN, we could not develop ourselves alone within the region. So we do need the support from outside the region as well. So for that, I agree with the Dr. Frederick address that we may need not only South-South collaboration, we also need the North-South collaboration, meaning that we need a kind of collaboration and technology transfer and technology collaboration with the developed country or the big pharma, that they can think about the collaboration and increasing the supply. I think one of the major inequity of vaccine access during COVID-19, one of the major thing is supply side. Even we're trying to address on the development during the pandemic, but it could not go fast enough. Thailand, we also have our local developed vaccine, but it could not go fast enough to address the pandemic. Resulted from that we don't have an adequate capacity to develop the vaccine. So again, we do need the collaboration, and I would like to put an example of the collaboration between AstraZeneca and Thailand, that we build up the manufacturing capacity in Thailand, and then with our local manufacturer that can produce the vaccine at the global standard level and export to our neighboring country within the region. I think this kind of approach that we do need to consider, that this model of collaboration. So those are the things that we are moving, and then as we are the focal point on ABSSR, we will have a kind of collective information exchange among our ASEAN member states. And the point of the way of ASEAN is a way, the thing that Dr. Frederick said, it's a consensus approach. So we do need to get all of the opinion and agreement from all member states to move on this. It can move a little bit slower, but again, this is the way of ASEAN that we agreed upon on the consensus approach. So we will collect the effort among our ASEAN member states. Some of us may have more capacity to join together in collaboration and share the resource infrastructure together, and as well as human resource together. So hopefully that it can be a good regional approach. I will stop here because it's a big question, but this is an approach that we are doing with our ASEAN member states. Over to you, Dr. Chanda.
Thank you very much. Yes, indeed, it was a question that requires a very extensive answer. But you highlighted some very important points, the need for human resource development, that's critical, of course. And also you highlighted the need for not just South-South, but also North-South collaboration and technology transfer. And in the context of ASEAN, of course, the fact that pace could be slow because you need a consensus building approach, but there are also asymmetries. And so there's again scope within the region itself to learn from each other within the bloc itself. So thank you very much for your intervention. Now I turn to Dr. Arora. My question to you is, in the context of South-South cooperation for the regionalization of pharmaceutical production, what could be key areas for transfer of technology or knowledge from countries such as India and China, where there has been success in the promotion of domestic R&D and pharmaceutical production capacities? Dr. Arora.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me for this very important discussion. I will start with the philosophy the Indian government is following at this time as far as health is concerned, which we call as Vasudev Kutumbakam. That means the world is a family, and we have to kind of collaborate and complement each other's strengths. In the context that health is a societal good, and it is not only vaccines but others, because pandemics does not just restrict ourselves to vaccines, but there are other health system and health treatment related issues. One important point which came up during last two presentations was destructive competition, and primarily it was in the context of the industry and the companies. But I would say that when we are talking about collaboration, this should not be also in the context for countries, among countries, a destructive competition among countries. So the governance issue, which Frederick very rightly highlighted, is important, that right from the beginning, it's a collaborative approach. Now, the issue of path-dependent equity, another point raised by Anthony. I thought I will try to split it because it is clearly that those who invest in that path, it leads to equity or inequity accordingly. I'll give you a little example of what we have done during last 2.5 years in terms of India transforming from a vaccine manufacturer primarily. We started initially with fill and finish, and then a manufacturing hub during last 20 years or so. But during last 2.5 years, I think something major has happened, which helped us to transform into a R&D hub as well as manufacturing hub for the vaccines. And it was not only for these, but even for equipment like ventilators, for PP kits and other kind of equipment also. And the whole approach has been a three-pronged approach. One is getting academics, whether they are South-based or North-based, getting them engaged with our industry. And a very proactive and a preemptive effort was made by departments of biotechnology, Indian Council of Medical Research, Department of Science and Technology, under the leadership that this needs to be brought together, that without a partnership between academics and the industry, the issues cannot move further. The second component was to invest heavily on infrastructure development, and which was very elegantly highlighted, that this supply chain business, whether it is we are talking about vertical integration or horizontal integration in terms of ingredients and other resources, if there is no surety, and we know that during the pandemic there was interruption, there were issues related to supply and of key ingredients. Therefore, India invested heavily on developing assays and animal study facilities across the country. 6-7 laboratories of each type, assays as well as animal studies. And this was done over a period of 1 year itself, to see that we don't have to be in the queue in front of global labs. Another investment was done that across the country, we have now 11 GCP compliant clinical trial sites. We can do drugs, we can do vaccines, other biosimilars products, equipment, they can be tried. So when we are talking about this transfer of technology and setting up manufacturing hubs, I think again the issue comes whether we encourage at country level our own industry and incentivize them. And this is being done to tell our industry that they should go to other countries where they can set up their manufacturing hubs. So what I'm trying to see is that local political environment and thought process is important. If technology transfer on one side, and the second is encouraging industry to establish manufacturing units, be it vaccine related or pharma products related. Here, I would also say that one of the initial steps the region can take is a South-South academic and scientific collaboration. That is very important. I think this kind of collaboration will not only breed trust and confidence, because I think that is one of the key issues to take this initiative of regionalization of health related products, that there is trust and confidence at the governance, at the government level, at the academic level, and then it comes to the manufacturing and the industry. So that's an important component which we should take it further. I'll stop at that, and if there are any further queries, I will try to.
Thank you, Dr. Arora, for highlighting some of the steps that India has taken, and also this very important point at the end about, bringing together South-South cooperation in the area of academic and scientific collaboration, if you really want technology transfer and trust building, etc. So let me now turn to the audience here. If there are any questions in the audience. If anyone wants to ask a question, please raise your hand, introduce yourself. Does anyone have a question? Okay. So fine. We will turn actually to a question that we have from our online, which is regarding import restrictions. So regulations regarding the import of medical products used in times of crisis, and whether we can have some sort of, I think the question that's being asked really is what sort of regulatory harmonization may be possible to prevent some of the restrictive measures that we've seen in the recent COVID pandemic, so that you don't have ad hoc reactions and there's more predictability in terms of the continued flow of essential health products. So would one of the panelists or presenters like to answer this question from our audience? Professor So, maybe?
Sure, I'll start actually, but I think perhaps some of the folks in the region might even be better positioned than I. Supply chain disruptions, certainly of some of the leading COVID-19 vaccine manufacturers, certainly led to production targets not being met at various points during the pandemic. But throughout the Asia Pacific region, what was interesting was the countries established a single window electronic submission system to speed clearance of vaccine shipments in hours sometimes. And so that was actually an impressive step forward. I'm sure, of course, there were hiccups along the way. And I'm sure this was no easy challenge to actually put into place. And I can't tell you really as much as perhaps some of our colleagues in the region as to whether operationally this was actually in reality as much as it was actually suggested in some of the background paper work that was done, of course, for the UNESCAP project with WHO. But I think that's an important advance. Some of the other issues I suspect actually perhaps some of our other colleagues on the panel might be better able to address.
Sure, thank you, Dr. So. In fact, I would like to ask that question to Dr. Arora.
Yes, thank you, Rupa. This regulatory issue is very, very important. And between the countries, we are not sure if a certain country has given regulatory clearance, what about the others? So, in fact, I understand the CRO, Southeast Asia Region WHO office, is working on a pattern similar to developing a EMA-like structure in the CRO region. These are, as very rightly said by Frederick, that these are not quick journeys. EMA took 30 years. But I think a beginning has to be made. It may take 5 years, 10 years, because the regulators, again, just like countries don't want to cede their sovereign autonomy, similarly, regulators also have. So some kind of a mechanism has to be brought in. And a prerequisite for these will be that country level regulators have to be strengthened, because we know that a lot of countries are still at L1 and L2 of regulatory maturity. And unless all the regulators, of the region come up to L3, L4, or at least there is capacity building so that jointly they can start working with each other and make a regional hub. So regulatory issues are absolutely important, and it is equally important that the regulatory hub which comes out as a region should have the same credibility and therefore the same kind of rigorous, robust processes like some of the credible regulators of EMA, or we are talking about FDA. Over.
Thank you very much. We have another question from our online chat. This is quite an interesting question. In some countries, vaccine donations are accepted for human research, but the government has not informed the public and has not ratified human research ethics. How do we deal with it? Who would like to take it from the panel? Dr. Premsri?
Oh, yes. I think that's about the local law or the local regulation on human research. I think this is the way that in the long-term development that we do need a registration, a regulation or the legal mechanism on conducting of human research within the country. So I think it's about a law and regulation that we need to deal with it, so that whoever that will conduct the human research will comply with the GCP or whatsoever on the information that we need to inform to the volunteer who participated into the trial. So that's my point.
Thank you very much for highlighting again the importance of the regulatory capacity building in countries at various levels, whether it's on approvals or whether it's, how vaccine research is done. Let me ask a question to the panelists now regarding, the complementary sort of development that is required in national health systems. We've been talking about regional cooperation prospects, but we know that the development of related capacities in national health systems is also very important to support manufacturing capacity for vaccines and therapeutics. So based on your extensive experience in your respective countries, could you comment what are those key ingredients in terms of strengthening national health systems that would be required to support such production? And what are some good inter-country, maybe cooperation arrangements or best practices that you might have seen, which you could talk about here to the audience? Thank you. Dr. Arora, maybe?
Yeah, thank you. So I will outline 3 or 4 things in this. I think IT would play a very important role in terms of system strengthening. Our own experience with the IT platform convened, which helped us and to monitor 2.2 billion doses delivered so far in the country. So, and each individual is kind of tracked. The second is supply chain interruption, so that every site which is delivering the vaccine is held accountable, and one knows from this. So IT is a very important component. Similarly, for surveillance system, I think surveillance is an equally important component. And here I would like to say that India has started 2 surveillance systems. One is surveillance of infections. I mean, whoever is getting COVID-19 infection. And there is a national database which is being kind of developed, and over the time, almost 880 million tests which have been done are available on that. The third dimension is genomic surveillance. And again, across the country, genomic surveillance is going on for COVID, and now it is to be extended to other viral illness. Here, I would also like to say that an initiative has been taken to handhold and build capacity of 5 adjoining South Asian countries: Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Myanmar. That these both helping in both in terms of infrastructure, so that we can have a regional surveillance system. Coming at the delivery level, again, this pandemic has shown that delivery requires, for the first time, adults were being immunized. Globally, I think nowhere such. And we have immunized almost all the adults. At least 1 dose has been received to 98%, and 2 doses to 93% of adults more than 18 years. And for this, how to establish and build on existing routine immunization infrastructure, so that immunization centers across the country in every part, rural, urban, remote geographical areas, inaccessible areas, and how to deliver vaccines, including use of drones. So I think this was an opportunity taken for system strengthening, and this will certainly help in coming time, the other system. And I must say that next month, routine immunization all will be taken up on COVID infrastructure. So I think a bundle of a package of interventions which the countries have learned can be used for system strength. Over.
Thank you very much for highlighting some of the important elements of national health system strengthening, and also highlighting that example of regional surveillance system cooperation within South Asia. Now, I would like to turn to Professor Abbott. There is a question specifically on IP. What is the approach to plagiarism of IP in medicines and medical devices? Some governments have cited critical situations as a policy through government research funding agencies and enacted legislation prohibiting public criticism. If you could just highlight the role of IP in terms of preventing, the plagiarism. I mean, what does it really mean in terms of strengthening of legal systems?
I'm not sure I followed kind of the last part of the question.
Yeah, it's a little odd. Yeah.
But Well, it goes without saying, and we haven't discussed it much here, that intellectual property is a key component of vaccine manufacturing processes and R&D. And any effort at regionalization is going to have to address IP issues in a systematic way. There's any number of approaches that can be taken with respect to that. We've been discussing access to technology and, in improving licensing terms and conditions, voluntary licensing, in some cases, compulsory licensing or government use licensing, and how and when those types of different modalities may be useful, how to use joint venturing in terms of creating technology transfer infrastructures and so forth. I'm not sure what is really meant by technology plagiarism. Maybe that's meant by patent infringement or piracy or what have you. But Anthony, for example, was discussing the idea of liability systems and how that might be a way of kind of avoiding some of these problems by having, a rule that revolves around paying for what you use, but not being impeded from using it. And that might be a healthy approach. But that's a very complex set of questions involving IP. And so I'm not exactly sure what the question was getting at, but that's a big subject matter to cover. I wanted to make one small point with respect to the last question. Just very quickly.
1 minute.
A core issue is sustainable financing. And everybody, I think, involved in the whole vaccine area recognizes that vaccine demand can be episodic. You have, high risk events, but low probability. And when you have a vaccine manufacturing facility, you can't really let it sit idle. You need to have test runs being run and so forth. And so getting governments to understand that you can't simply step in at one moment and say, now it's time to gear all this up, and then we're going to stop financing these activities. You really need a program for sustainable financing, whether it's at the national, regional, or global level.
Thank you very much. Yes, that is true. There are too many elements in this whole process. It's like an ecosystem that has to be developed to really bolster manufacturing capacity in essential health products. So thank you to all our panelists and presenters, as well as those who've asked questions from the chat for a very lively discussion. And I know we've only graced the surface of most of the issues because these are highly complex issues and there's not enough time to go into an extensive discussion. So thank you very much. And now I turn over to Dr. Srinivas Tata to make the concluding remarks.
No, I'm going to keep this short. We're running out of time. So thank you for doing half my job very well for me in terms of thanking the presenters. I really want to thank Rupa for moderating this panel, and also all the presenters for laying out a wonderful, what could be a framework for a regional strategy to address vaccine sufficiency in the region. And I think it gives us a lot of food for thought. We have noted the strong role played by countries from the South, especially in COVID, in providing vaccines for the population. There's been great inequity, but I think there was a great role played by countries from the Global South. And I think there's a great role for strengthening South-South cooperation, which, as has been stressed repeatedly, needs to be supplemented by North-South and triangular cooperation. Clearly, we need everyone at the table. And we also note that it's not just actions within the manufacturing sector which will lead to vaccine sufficiency and equity, but we need actions within the health system in terms of cooperation, in terms of research and development, as well as academic and scientific cooperation. So thank you very much for attending, and thank you so much for your patience. I think we've heard a really fruitful panel, a wonderful panel, and it gives us a lot of thought then for the future. Thank you so much.